It was never supposed to happen. Not here, not like this. But sometimes, the most dangerous secrets are born out of the simplest encounters. Claire had always prided herself on her self-control. At 45, she knew the rules of the game, she'd played them well enough to survive in a world that often undervalued women like her. Yet here she was, breathless and on edge, her hands trembling as she reached for the glass of wine that had been set before her. It wasn't the vintage she tasted, though, as she took a long, slow sip. No, it was the thrill coursing through her veins, the electric undercurrent that had taken her by surprise the moment he leaned in, his voice warm and honeyed, whispering a joke that made her laugh in a way she hadn't in years. It was a laugh that peeled back layers she'd kept locked away for so long she'd almost forgotten they existed. He was younger, with eyes that seemed to hold a challenge, a daring invitation she was not prepared to accept, yet she found herself lingering, craving more. It was just harmless banter, she told herself. Flirting was nothing more than a dance, a playful exchange meant to be enjoyed and then tucked away with a polite smile. But the tension crackling between them said otherwise. Claire's mind raced. Why do I feel this way? She wondered, her heart pounding harder with each passing second. Was it the way he looked at her, as though he could see right through the facade she'd built over the years? Or was it the way he had touched her hand briefly, his fingers grazing hers, sending a shockwave straight to her core? It was an innocent touch, or at least it should have been. But that single moment had cracked something deep inside her, awakening a desire she had buried beneath layers of responsibility and restraint. Why now? She thought, clenching the stem of her glass. Why, after years of ignoring such impulses, did she feel her composure slipping so effortlessly? As she glanced at him, a sudden, undeniable realization formed in her mind. Sometimes, the most dangerous desires are the ones that feel the most forbidden, and that was the beginning of her unraveling. The air between them had changed, thickening with an unspoken promise that neither of them dared to voice. Claire tried to focus on the conversation around her, on the clinking of glasses and laughter that filled the crowded lounge. Yet all she could feel was the heat of his presence beside her, each movement, each breath an echo of that charged moment when his fingers had grazed hers. Her mind reeled back to the way he had looked at her, eyes full of a confidence that seemed to undress her, to peel back her carefully constructed layers one by one. She wasn't supposed to notice someone like him, much less entertain the idea of anything more. He was younger, with a grin that hinted at danger and a voice that dripped with flirtation, and she knew better than to let herself get carried away. But temptation had a way of sinking its claws in deep, whispering promises she found impossible to ignore. Claire, are you even listening? Her friend Lydia's voice broke through her haze, and Claire turned, feeling her cheeks burn. She forced a laugh, shaking her head as if to clear the fog of her thoughts. Sorry, I got a little lost in the crowd, she replied, hoping the lie would suffice. Lydia arched an eyebrow, suspicion mingled with curiosity. Lost in the crowd? Or in someone's eyes? Lydia teased, nudging her playfully. Claire's heart skipped a beat, but she managed a laugh, brushing off the comment even as she felt her pulse quicken. Her gaze drifted back to him. He was across the room now, talking to a group of friends, but it was as if there was an invisible thread between them, pulling her attention no matter how hard she tried to resist. His eyes met hers, and he held her gaze for a second longer than was polite, a mischievous smile curving his lips. The butterflies in her stomach were relentless, an unsettling mix of nerves and excitement. Claire took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. This is absurd, she thought. She wasn't some inexperienced teenager. She was a grown woman, grounded and rational, with responsibilities and a life she had worked hard to build. Yet here she was, feeling like she was on the edge of a cliff, one step away from a free fall. It was then that he made his move. Smooth, casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he approached her. The world seemed to narrow around them, the buzz of the room fading as he leaned in, his voice soft but powerful. Mind if I steal you away for a moment? He asked, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. Claire's breath caught, and for a moment, she was paralyzed by the rush of adrenaline that spiked through her. This was dangerous. This was foolish. Yet there was something exhilarating in that very danger, a thrill she hadn't felt in years. Why, she managed to ask, her voice steadier than she felt. He smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. Because I've been wanting to ask you something, he replied, his voice dropping to a low murmur. And it's not the kind of question one asks in front of an audience. A shiver danced down her spine. Her rational mind screamed at her to decline, to walk away, to laugh it off and return to her safe, predictable world. But something else, a part of her she barely recognized, wanted to see where this would lead. She nodded, and he led her through the throng of people, out into the cool night air. The quietness of the street was a sharp contrast to the lively atmosphere they had just left, and Claire felt her heart race as he turned to face her. The street lamp cast a soft glow over his features, accentuating the confidence in his smile. "So, what's this question that couldn't wait?" she asked, crossing her arms in a weak attempt to shield herself from both the cold and the vulnerability she felt in his presence. He took a step closer, his expression softening. "Why do you hide?" he asked, and the sincerity in his voice cut through her like a knife. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Why do you hide?" It was such a simple question, yet it carried the weight of truths she wasn't ready to face. She had hidden for so long, behind her responsibilities, behind the expectations of who she was supposed to be. But now, under the scrutiny of his gaze, those walls felt paper-thin. "I don't know what you mean," she lied, but he didn't look convinced. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with a curiosity that felt almost too intimate. "Yes, you do," he said softly. His fingers reached out, just grazing her cheek, and it was as if time itself paused. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow, as the temptation of that touch unraveled something deep inside her. Her defenses crumbled, and for the first time in years, she let herself feel, really feel. The fear, the longing, the thrill of stepping into the unknown. And in that moment, she knew that whatever came next, there was no going back. The night was heavy with anticipation, thick with the kind of energy that promised something unforgettable. Claire stood under the dim streetlight, her pulse racing as she tried to gather her thoughts. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the intensity that made the hair on her neck stand on end. Her lips curved into a small, knowing smile, the kind that hinted at secrets and promises unspoken. "Is this where you plan to disarm me?" she asked, her voice low, a sultry edge that she hadn't used in years. The playful confidence in her tone was a mask, but one she wore well. If she was going to flirt with danger, she was determined to do it on her own terms. He took a step closer, the space between them disappearing, and she held her ground. His eyes searched hers, and Claire could see the desire there, barely restrained. It made her feel powerful in a way she had almost forgotten she could be. It was a delicious reminder that she still knew how to command attention, how to pull someone in with nothing more than a glance and a few well-chosen words. "Disarm you," he repeated, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I think you're the one doing that to me." Claire tilted her head, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Is that so?" she teased, her voice dripping with a confidence that drew him in, like moth to flame. "Then maybe I should be careful. Wouldn't want to take too much advantage." The way he looked at her sent a thrill down her spine. She could feel the pull between them, magnetic and undeniable, and it was clear that he was as captivated as she was. The thrill of it all made her feel alive, her senses heightened, every word she spoke deliberate and laced with meaning. "You don't strike me as the kind of woman who plays it safe," he murmured, his voice husky, and she couldn't help but smile. "No," she replied, leaning in ever so slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "I'm not. But I'm careful about who I give my attention to. Only the ones who can handle it." Her words were a challenge, one that made his eyes darken with desire. It was a dance, a game, but one that had real stakes. Claire could feel the fire between them, the way he hung on her every word, and she reveled in it. She hadn't felt this kind of power in years, the kind that came from knowing exactly how to drive a man wild. He reached out then, his hand brushing against her cheek, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "And do you think I can handle it?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Claire's smile deepened, a tantalizing promise in her gaze. "That depends," she said softly, her tone both inviting and elusive. "Can you keep up with me?" The question hung in the air, and she knew she had him right where she wanted him. The tension was electric, the kind of chemistry that made it impossible to look away. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to surrender to the moment, to the power of her own allure, and the thrill of knowing she was the one in control. In that moment, Claire wasn't just a woman, she was an enchantress, weaving a spell that neither of them could escape. And as he leaned in, his lips just a whisper away from hers, she knew she had him hooked. The line between control and surrender had always been clear for Claire, until now. Standing there, enveloped in the heat of his gaze, she could feel that line begin to blur, unraveling with every second that passed. The air was charged, an intoxicating blend of desire and danger, and she felt herself teetering on the edge of something she couldn't quite name. He didn't touch her right away. Instead, he watched her, his eyes searching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that she might pull back. But Claire didn't move. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in shallow waves, and she knew that if she didn't make a decision soon, she would lose herself completely. He took a slow step forward, closing the space between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hand reached out, fingers grazing her arm, and she shivered despite herself. It was such a simple touch, but it was enough to ignite every nerve ending, to make her wonder how far she was willing to go. "Claire," he murmured, her name rolling off his tongue like a secret. There was something in his voice that made her stomach twist with anticipation, a hunger that mirrored her own. She swallowed hard, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. "You shouldn't be here," a voice in the back of her mind whispered. "This isn't who you are." But that voice was drowned out by the pounding of her heart, the thrill of feeling wanted, desired, in a way that left her breathless. "Tell me to stop," he said softly, his voice laced with restraint. It was a challenge, a lifeline he was offering her, a chance to pull back before it was too late. But the last thing Claire wanted to do was stop. The temptation had dug its claws in deep, and she wasn't ready to let go. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes dark with longing. "What if I don't want you to stop?" she whispered, and she could feel the shift in him, the way his restraint fractured, giving way to the chemistry that had been building between them. The words were out, and there was no taking them back. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch firm but gentle, and she leaned into him, feeling the electric spark where their skin met. His lips hovered over hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, he kissed her, and everything else fell away. It was a kiss that shattered boundaries, one that made her forget who she was supposed to be. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, and she responded with a fervor that surprised even herself. Years of carefully constructed walls crumbled under the intensity, and she let herself get swept away, lost in the sensation of being completely consumed. Time seemed to blur, the night spinning around them as they pressed closer, neither of them willing to break the spell. Claire had never felt so alive, so free, and she couldn't help but wonder if this was what she had been missing all along. But even as the passion took over, a sliver of fear lingered in the back of her mind. She was dancing on the edge of something that could change everything, and she had no idea where it would lead. Yet, in that moment, with his hands on her skin and his lips claiming hers, she found herself not caring. All she knew was that she had crossed a line, one she could never uncross, and she was powerless to stop herself from wanting more. The world had gone quiet around them, but the storm inside Claire was anything but silent. The way he kissed her, hungry, desperate, like she was the only thing he needed, left her trembling, her body arching into his with a desire she hadn't known she could still feel. His hands roamed over her back, strong and sure, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. Every touch was a promise, every kiss an invitation to dive deeper, to surrender fully. Claire gasped as he pulled her closer, his lips leaving a heated trail down her neck. She tilted her head back, giving him access, and a low moan escaped her lips. She hadn't meant to be this undone, but he had shattered every defense she had left. He made her feel wanted in a way that was primal, raw, and she relished every second. "You're intoxicating," he murmured against her skin, his voice rough with desire. The way he looked at her, his eyes dark and full of longing, sent shivers down her spine. She knew he was completely caught up in her, just as she was in him. And that knowledge made her feel powerful, irresistible. She let out a breathless laugh, her hands sliding over his chest, feeling the hard muscles beneath. "Is that so?" she teased, her voice sultry, a challenge in her gaze. She wanted to drive him wild, to see him lose control, just as she had. The way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes burned, told her she was succeeding. "You have no idea what you do to me," he confessed, his voice thick with need. His words made her heart race, and she bit her lip, a smile playing on her lips. She leaned in, her mouth brushing against his ear. "Then show me," she whispered, the words a dare, a promise. She was done holding back, done pretending she didn't want this as much as he did. And when his hand slid down to her waist, gripping her firmly, she knew he was ready to do exactly that. Their lips collided once more, and this time, there was no hesitation. They moved together, bodies pressed tight, as if trying to fuse into one. The passion between them was electric, a current that left them both breathless and wanting. His touch was confident, his kisses demanding, and Claire gave herself over to the pleasure, to the heady rush that made her feel more alive than she had in years. But as the intensity reached its peak, something shifted. A sliver of reality seeped into the heat of the moment, reminding her of the life she had outside this encounter. The responsibilities, the expectations, everything she had built over the years loomed at the edge of her mind. And suddenly, she pulled back, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. He looked at her, concern flashing in his eyes. "Claire," he asked softly, his hand still cradling her face, his touch gentle. She met his gaze, a million thoughts racing through her mind, but one thing stood out among them all: she didn't regret this. "Not a single second. I'm not used to feeling this way," she admitted, her voice trembling, but there was a newfound strength in her words. She had crossed a line she thought she'd never dare approach, and she had discovered a side of herself she had forgotten. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. He smiled, his thumb brushing over her bottom lip, making her shiver. Maybe it's time you let yourself feel, he whispered, and his words struck a chord deep within her. It wasn't just about the chemistry, the overwhelming attraction. It was about being seen, being truly alive. Claire took a deep breath, her fingers still tangled in his shirt. She knew she couldn't stay in this fantasy forever, that reality was waiting for her just around the corner. But she also knew that this moment would stay with her, etched into her skin, a memory that would make her smile even on the darkest days. With one last, lingering kiss, she pulled back, her lips swollen and her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice sincere. He looked at her, a question in his eyes, but she just smiled. "For reminding me what it feels like to be wanted," she said. And with that, she stepped back, her fingers slowly slipping from his grasp, leaving him wanting more. As she walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement, she felt the weight of what had happened settle over her. It was reckless, maybe even dangerous, but it had been worth it. Because for the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. And as she disappeared into the night, she couldn't help but smile, her lips still tingling from his kiss, knowing she had left a mark on him that he would never forget. The night held secrets, and so did she. But some secrets were meant to be savored.